本會現在舉行2018年1月31號嘅立法會例行會議。
Meeting of the Legislative Council on the 31st of January. Questions. Question 1. The Honourable Andrew WAN. President, the Secretary for Home Affairs is not here. If members pay close attention, you would know that the official is already here. I am paying attention, but he is not in his seat. Is it that he can walk around the chamber as he likes? The Secretary is seated here. He has not been walking around. He is in his seat. President, I will not dwell on a war of words with you. It was so chaotic, and you asked me to rise. I rose immediately, and then I glanced at the seats. I could not see him. Please ask your question. At question time, members should only rise to read out his question. He does not have the freedom to speak freely. Mr. President, you used 20 seconds of my time. President, the government has leased dozens of pieces of land under private recreational leases, PRLs, to private clubs for them to develop sports and recreational facilities for use by their members. Fanling Golf Course, FGC, is one of them. According to the results of an opinion survey conducted by the Democratic Party from the end of last year to early this year, among the some 1,000 respondents, about 70% of them considered that the land resources occupied by FGC was excessive. Moreover, 90% of the respondents opined that the government should rezone FGC for other uses. Among them, the percentage of those who thought that the site should be used for developing public housing, government or community facilities and private housing were 55%, 17% and 12% respectively. On the other hand, it was reported in the press early this month that, as pointed out in the report of a study conducted by the Planning Department, it was technically feasible to use a 16-hectare site in the eastern part of FGC, which was close to the major infrastructure in the district, for building 5,000 to 6,000 residential units. Although there were old trees and graves on the site, they would not affect the building of such units. Regarding sites leased under RPLs, will the government inform this council, one, whether it will make reference to the aforesaid survey results and decline to renew the PRL for FGC upon its expiry in August 2020, in order to make the site available for housing development? Two, whether it knows how the situation of FGC's facilities being opened up to outsiders in each of the past 5 years compares to the undertaking made by the lessee, whether the government will require the lessee to step up publicity on the arrangements for opening up FGC's facilities to outsiders. And three, of the number of PRLs not renewed upon expiry, with a breakdown of the reasons and site areas by name of lessee, and the number of cases in which the government continued upon expiry of PRLs to lease the sites concerned to the lessees by way of short-term tenancy or private treaty instead in the past 10 years, and set out the term of the new leases by name of lessee. Secretary for Home Affairs. President, in the past, owing to the limited provision of recreational and sports facilities in Hong Kong, people interested in promoting sports development and providing recreational and sports facilities established sports clubs and applied to the government for grant of land to develop such facilities. In addition to private sport clubs, non-profit-making organizations such as social and welfare organizations, uniformed groups, national sports associations, district sports associations, and civil service organizations were granted land by the government to develop recreational and sports facilities under private recreational leases or PRLs at nil or nominal premium. Of the existing 66 PRL sites in Hong Kong, 39 are granted to community groups such as social and welfare organizations, uniformed groups, national sports associations, and district sports associations, as well as civil service organizations. The remaining 27 PRL sites are held by private sports clubs. In 2014, an interdepartmental working group was set up by government to comprehensively review the PRL policy. The working group has examined a number of issues relating to the PRL policy and will recommend a series of measures to ensure that the operation of private sports clubs and the use of PRL sites can better meet the dual objectives of supporting sports development and optimizing public resources. The policy review is such that we expect to report the review findings to the Electoral Panel on Home Affairs within the year and subsequently consult the public and stakeholders. Regarding the three parts of the questions, my reply is as follows. One, as the Bureau responsible for sports development, the Home Affairs Bureau HAB will examine in detail each and every private sports club's contribution to the implementation of the government's sport development policy, including promoting community sports, supporting A-list sports, and making Hong Kong a center for major international sports events in order to consider whether to support the continued use of the sites concerned. If the government decides to resume a particular site, relevant bureaus and departments will carefully consider, in accordance with the established mechanism, alternate uses of the site or any parts of it. To strengthen the role of PRL site in supporting sports development in Hong Kong, the Executive Council approved in 2011 the addition of greater access requirement during the renewal of PRLs. Under this policy, a provision was added to PRLs expiring in 2011 and 2012 when they were renewed, to require the opening up of sports facilities to eligible outside bodies for a minimum of 50 hours per month. Eligible outside bodies include schools registered under the Education Ordinance, non-governmental organizations receiving recurrent subvention from the Social Welfare Department, uniformed groups and youth organizations receiving recurrent subvention from the HAB, national sports associations and government departments. Lessees are required to submit their opening up schemes to the HAB for approval before the lease renewal. When vetting such schemes, HAB will consider the provision of facilities by individual lessees. Those with more sports facilities available for use by eligible outside bodies will be required to commit more opening up hours. The current lease signed for the Fanning Golf Course was made in 1999. Therefore, this did not include the greater access requirement which was added in 2011 or 2012. The lessee, that is the Hong Kong Golf Club, is therefore not required to submit an opening up scheme under the lease. Despite this, the club has been encouraged to open up facilities to outside bodies and promote the opening up arrangements. It is also required to submit quarterly reports on the opening up of facilities to outside bodies. According to the lessee, the FGC's 18-hole golf courses and driving ranges are open to the public from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. and from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. respectively on weekdays. Outside bodies such as schools, social and welfare organizations, the Hong Kong Golf Association and the Hong Kong Schools Sports Federation also use the facilities of the club. In 2017, the Fanning Golf Course held about 120,000 rounds of golf activities, with about 50,000 rounds by non-members, which accounts for over 40% of the overall utilization. Number 3, PRLs are one type of government land leases. Leaseholders may apply with justifications to have their original lease arrangements replaced by other land leases. For PRL sites with committed development uses, the government may resume under the Land Resumption Ordinance or via existing leases all or any parts of such sites for public use. Information of PRLs not renewed or leased on alternative arrangements in the past 10 years is at the Annex. Thank you, President. Mr. Andrew WAN. Madam Deputy, the reply does not respond to the survey done by the working group. I don't know why you can't report any progress even at the Legislative Council. And also, the Task Force on Land Supply has not received a paper on this after several meetings were held. It is said that in 2017, there were 120,000 rounds of golf activities. About 50,000 rounds were done by non-members. meaning there were 329 games every day, and out of those, there were 129 which were made by non-members. I'd like to ask him to clarify. I'd like to remind members that they should only ask one supplementary. Secretary, SHA. First, about the utilization at FGC. We mentioned 120,000 golf games and 50,000 games were played by non-members. These are the figures supplied by FGC. It is a statement of fact. As for the review, it is almost near completion. The Task Force on Land Supply, if it holds a meeting on this, we are always ready to attend it. Mr. Wu Chi-wai. Thank you, Madam Deputy. According to the planning, the lease for FGC will expire in 2019. Recently, the Task Force on Land Supply was trying to discuss this, but no papers were supplied by the administration, and the task force questioned this. I'd like to ask this question. SHA, do you have the authority to decide on whether to renew the lease for FGC, or is it in the hands of the Secretary for Development or Secretary for Transport and Housing? The power to use the piece of land is with the Executive Council, meaning you have no authority to deal with this. Mr. Wu Chi-wai, the Secretary has answered your supplementary. Please follow up on other platforms. Mr. Shiu Ka-fai. Thank you, Madam Deputy. First, I like to declare that I don't play golf, but we should allow different people in Hong Kong to make use of sports venues in a fair manner. The FGC has been there for over 100 years. In every year, we have the Hong Kong Open, which is an international event, and there are 3 ranges with 18 holes each. We need to hold this mega event. 2 of the golf courses have to be combined in order to provide an international venue for that event, and the other course with 18 holes would be for spectators. Otherwise, we can't organize this international mega event. When people can make use of the remaining course, we understand that actually 40,000 people watched that mega event last year on site. If the golf course is used for housing, the Hong Kong status as a venue for international golf events will no longer be there. SHA, you are responsible for sports. How can you strike a balance with regard to opening up the golf course for public use? Please come to your supplementary. Please come to ask the question and then allow the Secretary to reply. We understand recently we have this elite sport player, Mr. Chan, who is gaining international reputation. Secretary, the member mentioned the FGC, and indeed, it organizes about 28 events of different scale. Most importantly, it organizes the Hong Kong Open, which is an international event, and it has organized it for 59 years. It certainly has a positive contribution to Hong Kong's status as an organizer of international golf events. Last year I was there, and indeed I saw 40,000 spectators, and 10,000 were from overseas. At the FGC, the sport of golf does develop healthily at this venue. Mr. Tanya Chan. Secretary, finally, I see you here. I have been following up this issue from 2009, and I'd like to tell Mr. Shiu Ka-fai that the FGC started with the lease being coming into effect on the 26th of December 1930. Mr. Secretary, you have been ducking all these issues, not to mention what the audit reports said. You said that this year you will submit the report, but here at hand, I have a copy of a report from the Advisory Committee on Private Recreational Leases appointed by Governor, and the report was issued in 1965. It was bilingual. It used 3 years to do a survey, and then in 1977, a task force or working group was set up. And then 2 years later, in 1979, this working group submitted a report, and it proposed changes to the policy. And then in 1990, the Audit Commission mentioned it, and then the PAC issued a report. And then in 2012, the Ombudsman mentioned it, and then 2013 there was another audit report, and in 2014 you told us that you set up a working group, and it was said that by the end of 2014 there should have been an initial report, but we didn't see anything, and then by the end of 2016 you said there would be a report. Other people used only a few years, and now we are in 2018, and you are still talking about next year. Madam Deputy, he said by the end of 2016 and then by the end of 2017. And now he says within the legislative year of 2017-18. And now he talks about this year. How is it so difficult? How difficult is it? You are shirking your responsibility. Why is it so difficult? Why can't we squeeze that report out of you? Yes, your supplementary has been asked. Please sit down. Secretary, I understand Ms. Tanya Chan is very well versed with the topic, and exactly because of that, you will understand that over 66 leases are involved, and there are sports clubs of different forms. That is why we have set up the interdepartmental working group to study the issue. In the process of the review, definitely we have used some time in order to be prudent. But as I said, the report is almost ready for consideration by the Task Force on Land Supply. When we approach an issue, apart from reviewing the previous or past approach, what is more important is to chart the way forward. Ms. Chan will understand that these clubs have a long history, but times have changed. The public also have different aspirations as times change. Today, in terms of the public's aspirations and in terms of the short supply of land resources, how should we make a new policy in order to map out the way forward for renewing leases? Should the public enjoy greater use? And also in terms of the land premium, should we increase that? We need to be very cautious in approaching these issues, and we must have discussions interdepartmentally. And I'm very glad to tell Ms. Chan that we are at the final stage and we are drawing our conclusion. The conclusion will be made available to the public and the Legislative Council as well as stakeholders. And we have looked at the existing situation of these dozens of leases, and we have looked at existing policy and past policies. We hope all these can be discussed in society so that we can come to a final conclusion. Mr. Jeffrey Lam. Madam Deputy, Hong Kong is an international financial center. We must have balanced development on different aspects. As an international financial center, we don't only need the Hong Kong Exchange or banks and build office buildings. We must meet other needs and aspirations in society. My question for the Secretary is, in terms of recreational and sports facilities, how can you balance the needs of society as a whole? In recent years, there has been an increasing demand for recreational and sports facilities. We can see that different clubs and venues are training up our young people who are putting up great performances. Recently, our bowling team got a gold medal, and windsurfing athletes also got very good results. Our women's golf athletes also did very well at international games. Young people need these venues for training. And when overseas athletes come here, we need to give them housing as well as recreational and sports facilities. Mr. Lam, what is your question? Please come to your supplementary. My question for the Secretary is, how can we balance recreation and sports facilities? Secretary, undoubtedly, Hong Kong sports are developing very well. And Hong Kong international sports events also enjoy a very good reputation internationally. We will support it, whether it is the rugby 7, windsurfing, cycling, marathon, or golf. We support the organization of all these international events in Hong Kong because we are going to do good in Hong Kong, not only in the financial aspect. As for training of young people, we have this strategy. Apart from the Kai Tak Sports Complex, which will hold international events, we also want to popularize sports by providing more venues for young people to start very young to come into contact with sports. That is why we are going to use $20 billion in the next few years to build 26 sports venues in the 18 districts. We are cooperating with 100 schools for them to open up their school venues on weekends for the NSAs or other sports clubs to do training. And by doing so, we can satisfy the need of private sports clubs by providing them with training venues so the public can use them and so young people can be trained. I can give you an example. Amongst the private sports clubs, there are 97 tennis courts. And also there are 27 swimming pools. These are private facilities, but at the same time, the public can also use them and, in fact, make use of them for training. This is what we are considering. We hope we have different levels for sports development, and that sports development should be three-dimensional. We should have international events, we should provide training, and we should allow the public to do sports. We have many members signaling to speak on this question, but please follow up on other occasions. Mr. Jeffrey Lam, do you have a point of order? Please give the mic to Mr. Jeffrey Lam. As Mr. Siu Ka-fai declared, I play soccer, I play badminton, I play table tennis, I play golf, I play tennis. I am also a member of many clubs, including FGC. Thank you.
Question number 2, the Honourable Chan Han-pan. Madam Deputy, the government implements the government vaccination program and the vaccination subsidy scheme annually to provide free or subsidized seasonal flu vaccination to groups which are at a high risk of infection, for example, children and the elderly. It has been reported that Hong Kong is now in the peak season of flu, and there have been sporadic outbreaks of influenza in the community and schools, resulting in the bed occupancy rates of many public and private hospitals reaching or even going beyond their capacities. In this connection, will the government inform this council, one, whether it knows the number of people diagnosed with flu, and among them the number of those who had received flu vaccinations within 6 months before contracting the disease in each of the past 5 years, whether the government has examined the reasons for some members of the public contracting flu even after they had received vaccinations, and if so, of the outcome. 2, of the percentage of the number of people who received flu vaccination in the population in each of the past 5 years, whether the government has reviewed the effectiveness of the above programs and scheme in preventing or reducing flu outbreaks in the community and schools, and if so, of the outcome. And 3, as it has been reported that as of the middle of this month, the pediatric inpatient bed occupancy rates of most of the public and private hospitals have reached or even gone beyond their capacities. For example, the occupancy rate of Tumen Hospital was once as high as 225%. And since the overcrowdedness of wards will increase the risk of cross-infection among inpatient children, of the government's immediate measures to address the shortage of hospital beds in pediatric wards. Secretary for Food and Health. President, vaccination is one of the effective means to prevent seasonal flu and its complications, and can reduce the risks of flu-associated hospitalization and mortality. Hence, the government has all along been encouraging the public to receive seasonal flu vaccination as early as possible. It also provides subsidized or free seasonal flu vaccination for eligible groups who are generally at a high risk of severe complications or even death caused by flu or spreading the flu to those at risk. Please refer to Annexes 1 and 2 for details. In 1718, the flu vaccines procured and used under various flu vaccination programs in Hong Kong are those recommended by the World Health Organization for use in the Northern Hemisphere. In consultation with the Center for Health Protection of the Department of Health and the Hospital Authority, I provide a consolidated reply to 3 parts of the question as follows. 1. For healthy individuals, flu is usually self-limiting with recovery within a week. The majority of infected cases in the community are not tested and confirmed. Given its prevalent nature, seasonal flu is not a statutory notifiable disease in Hong Kong. Hence, the CHP does not maintain statistics on the total number of people diagnosed with flu in the community. Nevertheless, the CHP conducts routine surveillance of cases of pediatric flu-associated severe complication or death among children aged under 16, and also cases of intensive care unit admission or death with laboratory diagnosis of flu among adult patients. In the past 5 years, there were a total of 123 cases of pediatric flu-associated severe complication or death. Among these cases, only 12% had received the seasonal flu vaccine for the respective season. During the flu seasons in the past 5 years, among the 2,368 adult cases of ICU admission or death with laboratory diagnosis of flu, the percentage of adults aged from 18 to 64, community living elderly people aged 60 or above, and elderly people aged 65 or above living in residential care homes, having received the seasonal flu vaccine for the respective season, were 4%, 27%, and 66% respectively. According to the WHO, when the vaccine strains closely match the circulating flu viruses, efficacy of flu vaccine in healthy individuals aged under 65 typically ranges from 70 to 90%. However, the actual efficacy depends on a host of factors. For example, degree of matching between the vaccine strains and the circulating strains, age of the vaccine recipients, timing of vaccination, and the presence of any underlying medical conditions that may impair the immune response. Many scientific studies show that flu vaccines could provide some degree of protection in preventing hospital admissions or deaths caused by flu. 2. The total number of people receiving flu vaccination under the government vaccination program and the vaccination subsidy scheme in the past 5 years are listed in Annex 3. Around 6.4% to 9.3% of the population join the 2 programs each year, and the percentage has been increasing year on year. Some members of the public may have received flu vaccination in the private sector at their own expense. In this connection, the actual percentage of people living or having received flu vaccination should be higher. Past local research studies show that the effectiveness of flu vaccination in preventing flu-associated hospitalization among children ranged from about 40% to 80%. According to the analysis of the CHP on the effectiveness of seasonal flu vaccination in elderly people living in residential care homes from 2011 to 12 to 16 to 17, it was found that the vaccine effectiveness in preventing flu-associated ICU admissions or deaths ranged from 37% to 69%. Besides, the CHP collaborated with the HA to analyze data of patients admitted to public hospital for respiratory symptoms during the winter flu season of 15-16. It was found that the effectiveness of flu vaccination in preventing flu-associated admissions among elderly patients aged 65 or above was about 40%. Overseas studies have also shown that providing flu vaccination for school children can reduce absenteeism and protect other high-risk groups, for example, the elderly. The CHB will continue to closely monitor local and global studies on flu vaccine effectiveness and flu and relevant scientific literature. In respect of public hospitals, the HA has been monitoring the bed occupancy rates in different specialties. Various measures have been introduced to alleviate the overcrowding in wards. During the peak season every year, public hospitals will exercise flexibility in deploying nursing power and hospital beds, including increasing the number of time-limited beds and day beds, adding temporary beds as necessary, and transferring patients from crowded wards to alleviate the overcrowded conditions. In the long term, the HA will include in its annual plan the initiative of increasing manpower and resources for the provision of new hospital beds to address the overall shortage of beds in a progressive manner. During the days when some wards of public hospitals may be overcrowded because of a surge in the number of hospital admissions, hospitals will implement various measures to alleviate the situation as far as possible, including transferring patients to other wards. Moreover, the HA will transfer suitable patients such as clinically stable surgical patients, orthopedic patients, and medical patients receiving rehabilitation treatment to private hospitals with low-cost hospital bed arrangement with HA for completion of treatment. On private hospitals, there were a total of 414 pediatrics and neonatology inpatient beds in 12 private hospitals across the territory at the end of 2017. As of 22nd of January 2018, approvals were granted to 2 of the hospitals for providing additional pediatric inpatient beds, thus increasing the total number of pediatrics and neonatology beds to 440. In addition, private hospitals have set up infection control teams and formulated policies, procedures, and guidelines on prevention and control of infectious diseases inside the hospital. Thank you, President. Mr. Chan Han-pan, the government has been asking people to receive vaccinations in face of flu. I've asked about the data for the number of people who have contracted disease and have received influenza within 6 months previously. HA staff said that there are additional beds during the winter surge, but there is no increase in the number of doctors and nurses, and the work pressure has been very tremendous. Is that allegation true? What are the measures to address that problem? You have raised your question. You can only ask one supplementary question, and that's related. Can I finish? You have already asked your question. That is relevant to my follow-up. Now, you have added in the number of beds, and you consider them as regular beds. And as a result, the occupancy rate has been lowered. It seems the government is trying to make up the numbers themselves. Is that allegation true? Thank you, Mr. Chan, for your question. The government, during the flu peak season, will review the occupancy rate of beds during normal times, especially for medical wards because of the aging population, and there has been a lot of pressure from chronically ill patients. For some of the wards, the occupancy rate is already over 100%. So different periods come with different circumstances. And sometimes the turnover rate has to be factored in as well. During the flu peak season, the hospital authority, in preparing for the season, will increase the number of beds. And there will be resources allocated to add in those beds. Of course, after the resources have been added in, if you are to immediately recruit regular staff members, that can't be done quickly. So very often, the resources will be deployed to hire temporary staff, part-time staff, or say use a special honorary scheme to add an extra manpower. That's not the most ideal arrangement. This is just a short-term and temporary arrangement. And in the short term, it can help relieve the work stress of healthcare staff and also enhance care for the patients. But in the long term, in terms of manpower planning, we should conduct a review, and we have to look at the existing number of healthcare staff and whether the number can cope with the aging population. If that is not sufficient, we should add in manpower progressively. I've asked the HA to give me a plan on the nursing manpower and take a look at the nursing manpower benchmark and how much additional manpower is required. After the HA's plan has been submitted to us, we will see how we should deploy more resources based on their demands. Dr. Kwok, well, just yesterday, 7 more people died. A total of 85 people died. 10 severe cases for children, 2 of them died. And for the 10 cases, none of them has received vaccination. The vaccination rate is lower than 10% and is the lowest among the developed nations. Your BARS has given additional funding of $500 million, but no fund is spent on vaccination. We've been asking the government to have vaccinations being carried out in the community. Apart from dishing out this $500 million, would you go to the schools, to the community, to give vaccinations to children and elderly, so that we will not be the laughing stock of the international community? We are just having a vaccination rate of below 10%. Dr. Kwok, for your question and comments, we think that vaccination is one of the effective means to prevent seasonal flu. And every year, we would be reviewing the vaccination rate of the at-risk groups. Every year, we will look at whether we should expand the subsidy and under the subsidy growth program, whether there is any further room for improvement in terms of the vaccination rates. Of course, we now think that there is room for improvement in terms of the subsidy level and the operation of the subsidy program. I think better arrangements should be put in place. If we want to increase the vaccination rate, apart from making the improving our arrangements and be more proactive, I would like to do more publicity and public education as well. Members of the public should be made more aware, and they can go to private doctors to receive vaccinations themselves. So we will doing work, strengthening our work on all fronts. We will continue with our work, and we'll do more. Dr. Kwok, my question was clear. Will they go to schools in the community to give vaccinations? You've already asked your question. How many more people would have to be dying from the flu before you would do anything? Thank you, Dr. Kwok, for your question. In terms of vaccination among children, long ago, we've appealed to different schools to approach the CHP. The CHP does have the guidelines, and they can also arrange for private doctors to go to schools to give vaccinations. And in this process, some schools have already done that, but it's not all schools which have done that. We have to strengthen publicity and public education, and we have also to explain to the parents, because some parents have some worries about flu vaccination. So we must do more on that front. In terms of vaccination in the community, say for at-risk groups, the elderly homes and elderly people staying in that can actually take the vaccination, receive vaccination at the HA, and they can go to the elderly health centers under the DH to receive vaccinations. We will continue to review the situation and expand our work on that front. Mr. Edward Lau, I have some specific suggestions for the Secretary. Seasonal flu vaccination should be received before the outbreak, and it would be most effective if it was received 2 weeks prior to the surge. And at the community, we help members of the public to receive vaccination. We haven't been reaching a lot of people. It's best that it can be done at schools for children. Now, if schools are to approach subsidized private organizations for vaccination, they are not very willing to do that. So not a lot of schools participate in the program. So my suggestion, Secretary, is that staff of DH should be dispatched to schools to give vaccinations to students. Secretary, thank you. President, I would like to thank Mr. Lau for his comment. The CHB has all along been hoping to arrange for more students to receive vaccination collectively, and that can help expand the coverage of the scheme. We have done work. We have conducted briefings and other publicity initiatives. And through the EDB, we have sent letters to primary schools, kindergartens, and their parents to publicize the issue. For now, however, the CHP is not fully equipped with manpower for it to actually send staff to go down to schools to give vaccinations. So I would like to review our current practices, and we would continue to encourage schools and school-sponsoring bodies to help children get vaccinations. We would work through the EDB to conduct briefings and to send letters to schools. So we want to enhance our work in this aspect to encourage more schools to arrange for vaccination in the school campus. What hasn't she answered you? You have already asked. I have already asked that. She has answered your question. Please sit down. She has answered. Will she be arranging for DH staff to go to schools? She has already answered. Mr. Kenneth Leung, people are very concerned about this winter surge, and the CHP, in order to increase the number of students receiving vaccination, in 16-17 has expanded the outreach service to provide vaccination to students aged 6 to 12. As of the 7th of January, 57 out of 500 schools participated. That's not desirable. And parents, when interviewed, said that they were worried that the child would get a fever after the vaccination. So they will not have their children getting a vaccination. This is the winter surge, but the Secretary is proposing medium to long-term measures. Do you have immediate measures to cope with the situation? Thank you, Mr. Lau. Children getting vaccination is something that we are concerned about. And earlier on, we have appealed vigorously and done a lot of public health education work. You mentioned that some parents were concerned about effects of children or response of children after receiving vaccination. The CHP will strengthen our work, our education work, so that parents understand that certain response or symptoms after vaccination are just normal. So I hope that parents will not be impeded because of this in having their children getting vaccination. Now, as to how we should encourage schools to arrange for vaccination to be conducted in campus. Now, apart from approaching the school sponsoring bodies ourselves through the EDB, we would send letters to schools, and that has already been done. And we would enhance our arrangements for schools which have conducted vaccination on campus. We would like to ask them to share their success stories with other schools. There is indeed a lot of room for improvement in terms of their vaccination rate. We would strengthen our work, hoping to do better.
Question 3, Mr. Charles Mok. President, according to the latest quarterly complaint figures on public transport services, about half the complaints were made against taxis, which show that the quality of taxi services is in need of improvement. The Consumer Council published a report last November recommending to the government the introduction of a parallel regime consisting of both taxis and e-hailing services to enhance the quality of point-to-point transport services through greater market competition. In this connection, will the government inform this council, 1, whether the government will, by drawing reference from recommendation of the Consumer Council and using the existing system of issuing hire car permits to private cars as a blueprint, introduce in phases on a pilot basis a regulatory regime for vehicles, drivers, and platforms for e-hailing services to increase market competition for point-to-point transport services, enhancing service quality, and facilitating the transition of in-service drivers to a new economic model? If so, of the implementation timetable and details, if not, the reasons for that. 2, given that promoting carpooling and car sharing was one of the recommendations in the report of consultancy study on Smart City Blueprint for Hong Kong published last June, the government decided not to incorporate this recommendation into the Hong Kong Smart City Blueprint, which was based on the report and published at the end of last year, of the process through which the decision was made and the relevant considerations and justifications. And 3, as the Chief Executive stated in the policy address last October, that in response to the emergence of a new economic models such as the sharing economy arising from advancement in technology, the government would review the existing legislation and regulations and remove red tape to foster the development of a new economy. Whether the Steering Committee on Innovation and Technology and the Committee on Taxi Service Quality will, from the perspective of fostering the development of a new economy, jointly examine the introduction of new regulatory regime for e-hailing services and consult the public and stakeholders on the relevant proposals, if so, of the details of the work plan and timetable, if not, the reasons for that. Secretary for Transport and Housing. President, as Hong Kong is a densely populated city with limited road space, the government has all along adopted the public transport-oriented policy with railway as its backbone. Various public transport modes serve their functions according to their respective roles and positioning. At present, over 12 million passenger trips are made through public transport services every day. This accounts for nearly 90% of the daily total passenger trips, which is the highest in the world. Personalized and point-to-point transport services in Hong Kong play an entirely different role compared with those of cities with a lower rate of public transport usage. My consolidated reply to Mr. Charles Mok's question is as follows. The government notes that the Consumer Council, in its report on competition in the personalized and point-to-point transport service market, recommends the government to consider the proposal of introducing regulated online hailing services. if the franchise taxis upon introduction fail to deliver its promise. On the premise that any carriage of passengers for reward must be lawful, we agree that the new demand for personalized and point-to-point public transport services of higher quality and fair and with online hailing features should be well addressed. To this end, the government has conducted a comprehensive review on the personalized point-to-point transport services, including taxis and hire car services under the public transport strategy study over the past 2 years, and recommended the introduction of franchise taxis to meet the new demand. The proposed franchise taxis will be a type of public transport services operated through a franchise model. Areas such as the number, service, fares, as well as drivers' quality of franchise taxis will be regulated by the government. If an operator fails to meet certain service level or standards, the government may impose penalties through franchise terms or even revoke the franchise. The cap on the number of franchise taxis, that is 600 vehicles under the current proposal, will be stipulated in the law. Franchise taxis will be operated under fleet management. This will help address the current difficulty in managing centrally the service quality of ordinary taxis due to scattered ownership. Franchise taxis and the online hailing service proposed by the Council have many features in common. For instance, franchise taxis must offer online hailing. The franchise will be time-limited with a limit on the vehicle age. All franchise taxis will be equipped with global positioning system devices to record real-time operating data for government inspection. The operators will also provide drivers training as well as a platform for lodging complaints and providing comments. Compared with the Council's proposal, franchise taxis provide higher transparency on fares. The government is preparing the legislative work with a target to introduce the bill into LegCo in the latter half of 2018. Meanwhile, taxis continue to constitute the majority of personalized point-to-point transport services in Hong Kong. The government will strive to enhance their service quality and operating environment. To further strengthen the interaction and cooperation with the taxi trade and relevant stakeholders, the Transport Department revamped and established a new Committee on Taxi Service Quality this month. The committee is chaired by the Commissioner of Transport and is composed of non-official members from various sectors. This multi-party platform will discuss various strategies and measures to drive changes under the current taxi licensing regime. With regards to optimizing taxi services through technology, the government is aware that there are a host of mobile phone applications equipped with online hailing functions in the market for passengers to hail or book a taxi. The committee will consider ways to encourage and motivate the taxi trade to improve and enhance services in this regard to meet passenger needs. Smart mobility is one of the key components for Hong Kong's development into a smart city. Our goal is to make use of technology to develop an intelligent transport system, assist in traffic management and alleviate traffic congestion and related environmental problems so as to bring overall benefits to the community. The government will progressively implement the measures under the smart mobility area in the Smart City Blueprint for Hong Kong, such as integrating various existing e-transport apps of the Transport Department into an all-in-one mobile app, installing a new generation of on-street parking meters, studying in-vehicle units to enable motorists to receive real-time traffic information and pay tunnel fees without stopping, and facilitating trials of autonomous vehicles in appropriate areas. The report of consultancy study on Smart City Blueprint for Hong Kong, which was submitted in June 2017 by the consultant commissioned by the government, put forward a number of recommendations for formulating the overall development framework of the blueprint. The recommendations include suggesting the government to promote carpooling, which does not involve the carriage of passengers for reward, but allows drivers or vehicle owners to recover part of the journey costs, such as fuel costs and tunnel toll, from the passengers, as well as car sharing, which does not provide chauffeur services but charges a rental based on usage of the vehicles rented and comes with proper insurance coverage. These two types of carpooling or sharing arrangements mentioned in the report are both permitted under the laws of Hong Kong and already lawfully used by some members of the public. As such, the government did not incorporate these recommendations into the blueprint, which was subsequently published. The government will nonetheless continue to take forward various initiatives under smart mobility featured in the blueprint. Mr. Charles Peter MOK, there's a saying called thinking outside the box, but the proposal is completely inside the box. How can we innovate and implement or realize a smart city? And the people are asking for online hailing services, but you are talking about franchise taxis, and you set a cap at 600. Online hailing vehicles are very different from franchise taxis. The government should not think that by improving the app, all the problems would go away, or else we won't have to be discussing this with you. In your reply, you said that there's higher transparency on fares for franchise taxis, but for online hailed cars, the internet is deployed, so there's greater transparency. As for the setting up of the Committee on Taxi Service Quality, Mr. Jeremy Tam is one of the members, but 1/3 of the members are from the taxi sector, and they have beneficiaries. Mr. Charles Mok, please raise your question. So you are only consulting the taxi trade. So my question is, can you expand the scope of this committee to cover other personalized point-to-point services, including online or e-hailing cars instead of just franchise taxis? Mr. Mok talked about the e-hailing vehicles. If you talk about thinking out of the box, e-hailing vehicles cover two aspects. One, the vehicles themselves. They could be taxis or other vehicles. And the other aspect is the e-hailing service. The hailing is done through the internet. So how can we provide e-hailing vehicles? So long as there is a demand for personalized point-to-point transport services, if we have the vehicles and reasonable fares, and if the hailing is conducted online, then that would be, you can consider them e-hailing vehicles. So whether they are taxis or other private cars is not the focus here. As for the Committee on Taxi Service Quality, the focus is on reviewing the service quality of the 18,000 existing services, and we seek to meet passenger expectations. So we need to strike a balance here. We need to take care of the existing 18,000 odd taxi drivers. We have more than 770,000 registered vehicles, and including the unregistered vehicles, we have more than 800,000. So if all of them are on the road, then congestion would be extremely serious. So we need to strike a balance here. But we realize expectations towards e-hailing vehicles by Mr. Charles Mok and the IT sector. So hopefully in the future, the committee can incorporate such views. As for the carriage of passengers for rewards, at the EU court, there was a recent verdict e-hailing vehicles are defined as public transport services, so we should also pay attention to the jurisprudence. According to the Hong Kong laws, carriage of passengers for reward must be regulated. If the carriage is unlawful, then it would be deemed illegal. Mr. Frankie Yik, well, he did not answer my question. Did he mean that the committee would only address taxis but not e-hailing vehicles? Secretary, do you have anything to add? I have nothing to add. Mr. Frankie Yik, thank you. Based on the quarterly complaint figures on public transport services, and that half the complaints were made against taxis, and if we draw the conclusion that taxi services are not satisfactory, it will be unfair to the practitioners. For the we have 930,000 passengers every year, and some people suggest or promote e-hailing services for greater convenience, and we have multiple e-hailing platforms already. But the success of such would hinge upon coverage. The issuing of new hire car permits will exacerbate congestion and air pollution. Mr. Frankie Yik, please raise your question. So the regulatory regimes are different, the fares are also different, and there would be unfair competition. So instead, we should introduce a central e-hailing system among the 18,000 taxis to enhance the matching rates between passengers and drivers. So, Secretary, would you coordinate the existing e-hailing platforms and issue relevant licenses in order to promote smart mobility? Thank you very much for the question. As I have said, public transport services make up nearly 90% of the daily total passenger trips, so the efficiency of the public system is very important. And taxis only make up less than 10% of the passenger trips. As Mr. Yik has said, of the prosecutions against taxis, about 1,000 are about fares, etc. So the percentage is still relatively low. As for the Committee on Taxi Service Quality, one important objective is to enhance taxi services. And the aspect of e-hailing would be covered, and we hope that the taxi trade can reinforce e-hailing services. How can they better provide personalized point-to-point services? I think myself and members share the same expectations. So for Mr. Mok and Mr. Yik, we are moving towards the same goal. But as we know, for certain e-hailing apps which are well established, they offer greater efficiency and flexibility. It takes time to develop an e-hailing app, so I have talked to the stakeholders personally, and if their existing apps fail to meet the needs of passengers, they would consider integrating our e-hailing app. So we hope that we can do more for the public in this regard. Mr. Jeremy Tam. President, in the reply, the Secretary talked about 600 franchise taxis. So I have a suggestion for the government. For the cap on the number of franchise taxis, you should allow people to participate in the scheme as long as they have their own vehicle. So the cap should be on the number of operating vehicles or vehicles on the road. So in other words, there might be say 2,000 vehicles who join the program, but at any given time, only 600 vehicles can go online. Please raise your question, Mr. Jeremy Tam. So this idea has its benefits. So would the Secretary consider this proposal? Would you allow more than 600 vehicles, except that only 600 could go online at any given point? On Mr. Tam's suggestion, our preliminary cap is 600 vehicles for franchise taxis, and we have specific requirements for these vehicles. For instance, the design of the vehicle, wheelchair accessibility, the use of e-hailing services, and we also want them to be operated under fleet management. We understand that a hard cap of 600 vehicles would be too stringent, so we are talking about 600 operating units. So when we issue licenses in the future, we would make sure that there are 600 operating vehicles at any given time. So 600 refers to the number of licenses, but not the number of vehicles. For franchise taxi services, as for the ecology of the taxi trade, we hope that an employment system will be in place so that drivers can make reasonable wages and that they would be motivated to improve their services. Currently, owners and drivers' interests do not tally. So in terms of vehicle maintenance, and the attitude or service quality of taxi drivers, there would be an impact. So under the franchise taxis program, we hope to balance the interests of different parties and we hope to improve personalized and point-to-point transport services in Hong Kong. And if the franchise taxis prove to be successful, when we review the service of the 18,000 taxis in the future, we might be moving in the same direction. So we might actually have more than 600 in the future.
Question number 4, Dr. Elizabeth QUAT. Thank you, Mr. President. It was reported that near the peak hours in the morning of the 11th of this month, signaling system faults of the East Rail Line, ERL, caused the suspension of train service of the entire ERL for more than 2 hours, which affected hundreds of thousands of passengers. As several passengers had made their way on their own onto the railway tracks by opening the emergency exits of the trains, staff of the MTR Corporation Limited (MTRCL) had to escort these passengers to leave at the nearby stations and inspect the railway tracks to ensure that all passengers had been cleared before the train service could be resumed. Such work lengthened the service disruption. Despite the efforts made by MTRCL to relieve the crowding of passengers according to its contingency plans, a great number of passengers were stranded at the various ERL stations and on the trains. Also, free shuttle bus service was seriously inadequate and directions were unclear, causing chaos and uproars. In this connection, will the government inform this council, 1. Whether the government will urge MTRCL to enhance its contingency plans for implementation during railway service disruptions, including 1. Improving the crowd control measures, 2. Stepping up broadcasting at stations and on trains, 3. Improving the communication channels among the staff, 4. Strengthening staff training on crisis handling skills and providing staff with clear guidelines, and 5. Stepping up public education on the rules for passengers to use emergency exits of trains. 2. As it is stipulated in the current service performance agreement that MTRCL must pay a fine for any railway service disruption lasting 31 minutes or above, whether the government will review the calculation method for and raise the levels of the fine with a view to reducing the occurrence of service disruptions through the implementation of more effective measures by the company's management, if so, of the details, if not the reasons for that. And 3. whether the government will conduct a comprehensive review on its policy of designating railway as the backbone of the public transport system so as to avoid the recurrence of the situation that the traffic of an extensive area is paralyzed during the railway service disruption. If so, of the details, if not the reasons for that. Secretary for Transport and Housing. Thank you, Mr. President. The following is my consolidated reply to Dr. Elizabeth QUAT's question. Hong Kong is a densely populated city with limited road space. Our challenge is to provide efficient and reliable public transport services for over 12 million passenger trips on a daily basis. Railway transport is a green and efficient mass transit which alleviates traffic congestion and attenuates pollution, and also unleashes the development potential of areas along the railway lines. Thus, the government has all along adopted railway as the backbone of the public transport system, while coordinating the complementarity among different public transport services with the aim to providing a comprehensive public transport system. Under such policy, the MTR provides services to over 5 million daily passenger journeys. Overall, its performance is safe and reliable. Nonetheless, the government understands that railway service is highly related to the daily living of the public. It is of paramount importance to enhance its safety and reliability so as to reduce the occurrence of incidents and to respond swiftly in the event of an incident. For this purpose, the government has put in place a stringent regulatory system. The Electrical and Mechanical Services Department, EMSD, regulates and monitors the safe operation of the MTR system and investigates into railway incidents in accordance with the Mass Transit Railway Ordinance. The Transport Department TD monitors the service performance of the railway network and handles complaints received from the public. At the same time, as the majority shareholder of the MTR Corporation Limited, or MTRCL, the government has been requesting the corporation to enhance its maintenance and upgrade its railway system in order to minimize the occurrence of incidents. Moreover, government departments require the MTRCL to formulate contingency plans for various kinds of railway incidents. In case of railway service delays, the MTRCL will, where situation warrants, activate suitable measures, including deploying more staff to assist passengers and providing shuttle bus services. In case of major incidents, the MTRCL will inform government departments, other public transport service operators, and the media, and disseminate train information to passengers through different channels as soon as possible, so that the public may keep abreast of the latest development. It is understandable that shuttle bus service is an emergency supplementary measure with limited carrying capacity, and it can hardly replace normal train service. On the day of incident, on the 11th of January, the MTRCL implemented measures according to the contingency plan, including deploying over 320 staff to assist passengers and implement crowd management measures. Over 133 shuttle buses were arranged to carry over 16,000 affected passengers within half an hour after the incident. The MTRCL also put up large signage containing shuttle bus information at affected stations and maintained close communication with TD and the media. Disseminate information to passengers about railway service disruption and other public transport connecting bus services through various channels such as broadcast at stations and inside train compartments, information display at stations and road signs, webpage and smartphone applications, etc. After the occurrence of the incident, TD immediately launched the Emergency Transport Coordinator Center to coordinate other public transport services. On that day, 21 franchised bus routes strengthened their services during the incident to assist in serving the affected passengers. TD and EMSD also deployed personnel to the stations to observe the situation on site. All in all, the MTRCL has taken measures in a swift and orderly manner on that day to minimize the impact of the disruption on passengers. Nonetheless, The government and board of MTRCL are highly concerned about the cause of the incident and how the contingency arrangements can be improved. Government representative in the MTRCL board has relayed our concern on the incident and requested the MTRCL to conduct an in-depth investigation. Regulatory departments have also requested the MTRCL to submit a detailed report on the incident in 2 months. We will review the existing contingency plan together with the MTRCL in the light of the experience drawn from the incident. Moreover, the government and the MTRCL are concerned about the fact that some passengers opened the train door on their own and walked on the tracks during the incident. To ensure safety of passengers and to avoid further service delay, the emergency door release should only be used under the direction of the train captain in case of emergency. The MTRCL will continue to educate the public, including the use of emergency exits on trains through different channels. The corporation will continue to arrange regular trainings for frontline staff with simulations of various train incidents and collaborate with various government departments in conducting drills to familiarize staff members with contingency plans and steps to handle emergencies. The government and the MTRCL completed the first review of the fare adjustment mechanism in 2013 and introduced the Service Performance Arrangement (SPA). While the MTRCL should be held accountable for serious service disruptions, lesser disruptions of a duration below 31 minutes should not be treated as serious cases, lest the frontline staff may rush their repair works under undue pressure, thereby putting railway safety at risk. We have examined views from the public on the SPA in the review last year, and overall, the SPA had been operating smoothly over the past few years. Despite so, in response to the government's request and the views of the public, the MTRCL agreed last year to raise the maximum penalty per incident under the SPA from $15 million to $25 million. The government holds a high expectation for railway services in the same way as the public and will continue to strengthen its oversight on the MTRCL's railway services and safety through various channels. Thank you, Mr. President. Dr. Elizabeth QUAT. Mr. President, according to the Secretary's reply, it seems that the MTRCL has done everything they could. The chaos would have been avoided. And the MTRCL, according to the reply, already adopted measures in a swift and orderly manner to minimize disruption to the service. But if you ask any passenger there on that day in question, none of them would agree. I received a lot of complaints that day. Many passengers said that they either waited outside the train station or inside the train compartment for 2 hours, and in the end, some of the doors were open, some of the doors were not, and as a result, passengers were unable to leave the train compartments as soon as possible. After leaving the train compartment, because of unclear directions, they were unclear which way to go, and some passengers, in the end, groped along the body of the train in leaving the tracks. It was very chaotic. Please put your question, Dr. QUAT. So if the government believed that the MTRCL already implemented proper contingency measures, I think there is a problem with the government as well. I think the government should work it out with the MTRCL as soon as possible. The government should request that a review be conducted on the contingency plan and step up training for their staff. My question is this. Railway as backbone of the public transport system, the government says it is essential. Well, I'm not against it, but there should be sufficient support. If the policy is to use railway as the backbone of the public transport system, there should be park and ride and other similar facilities to support the policy. Otherwise, although the government continues to say that this would be considered, nothing has been implemented. I want to know how the government is going to take this forward. Secretary, thank you, Dr. Kwok, for the question. Well, I want to stress in my reply, I mentioned that the MTRCL has taken measures in a swift and orderly manner. Of course, in the long run, we would request the MTRCL to conduct a review of the incident and make improvements. On the day in question, indeed, there were chaos, especially for 2 trains. They were stuck between 2 stations, and meanwhile, some passengers opened the emergency exit and walked along the tracks. Indeed, this caused some impact on their contingency measures. In fact, on that day, there were 31 departures for ERL. 14 trains were stuck between stations, basically within an hour. These 14 trains were able to arrive at stations to unload passengers. But as I mentioned, between Fanling and University and Fulton stations, there were 2 trains involved in an incident in which passengers opened the emergency exits. That was followed by some follow-up action to ensure that all passengers had left the track. That caused a further delay. Dr. Quat mentioned some passengers groping along the body of the trains and walking on the tracks. We hope that through public education and publicity in the future, the public would understand that in the case of a train incident, passengers should remain on the train and leave the site on the direction of staff. As to improvement measures in the future, as mentioned in my main reply, we have the interchange arrangements, and we in fact have park and ride facilities for over 10 stations. Well, the main reply has taken up more than 10 minutes. We have 2 members waiting in line. Please be seated. Well, in fact, it is not supplementary anymore. Many members have begun expressing their views such that the Secretary is unable to respond, and I don't think it's fair to put a number of supplementary questions in one time. Please wrap up, Secretary. Well, that's all for my reply. I'll give more time to members. Mr. Michael Tien. Mr. Michael Tien. Sorry, I just couldn't bear it. Well, Secretary, the Labour Union of MTRCL has relayed to me that starting from March last year, the number of assistants at stations have gradually been reduced, and the working hours have also been reduced. For a certain shift, if there is a lack of manpower, other staff members would be invited to take up the shift as overtime work. This affects a sense of belonging and the staff morale. Well, even without an incident, it already imposes greater pressure on staff members. Well, on the day in question, staff members were questioned by the passengers as to where there would be free shuttle service and when the service would be resumed. Well, for the station assistant, they only earn $50 per hour, whereas the MTRCL reaps a big profit every year. My question is whether the government would urge the MTRCL to review the work arrangements and pay for the station's assistants to make sure that there would be sufficient assistance to maintain the service quality. Secretary, I don't know whether you know there's been such a drastic cut in number. Mr. Michael Tien, please be seated. Your supplementary is totally irrelevant to the question and the main reply. Secretary, would you like to answer? Thank you, Mr. President. I need to go back and reflect this view to the MTRCL and see how to follow up on the matter. Mr. Hon Charles. Mr. President, it's been more than once since incidents happened along East Rail Line, and for this major incident, we believe that this is a complete meltdown of the public transport system. Well, there are different causes to an incident. One of the reasons could be the signaling system fault. I want to know when the MTRCL would improve its signaling system so as to avoid such a major traffic disaster. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. President. Our understanding is that by the end of this year and the beginning of next year, the signaling system of the ERL will be replaced. As for the catastrophe or the disaster, as mentioned by Mr. Chow, as mentioned by our main reply, it has very high capacity. For double-deckers, we're only talking about 200 passengers. For coaches, just some 50 passengers. Well, when an incident happens, as I mentioned, other kinds of transport are supplementary in nature. But we do give broadcast for passengers to take alternative transport to minimize the impact. Mr. Ben Chen. Frequent breakdown of the railway system would pose a huge impact on the life of people. Well, the DAB earlier published a proposal on improving the mechanism. For example, there should be a free complimentary ticket for passengers affected by the service disruption. At the moment, the MTRCL will not face a fine if the service disruption is less than 31 minutes. In order to incentivize the MTRCL to put in more resources to improve its service, we believe that for less serious disruptions, they should also face a fine. Would you consider that, Secretary? In terms of public service, penalty, of course, is necessary. But the crucial point is how we can make systemic improvement on the service quality of contractors and operators, including the MTRCL, to improve the service quality as well as avoiding occurrence of incidents. Financial penalties would, of course, serve as deterrents. But as I mentioned in the main reply, when the fines are meted out indiscriminately, it may pose significant pressure on frontline staff and the maintenance and repair staff, such that they may rush their work through, affecting service quality. This is absolutely not what we want to see. We give priority to safety over efficiency. We ask for your understanding. As for the penalty mechanism, as I mentioned just now, over the past few years, the mechanism has been working smoothly. Well, of course, things are not perfect. We'll continue to review the situation with the MTRCL on the service performance arrangement, and I'll also relay your view to the MTRCL.
Question number 5, the Honorable Kenneth LEUNG. President, the government has since 2011 granted gross floor area or GFA concessions to encourage developers to put in place electrical vehicle charging infrastructure in the private car parks of new buildings. According to the relevant technical guidelines, developers are required to install fixed electrical installations, FEI, and socket outlets in every parking space in the car parks. Install circuits up to the socket outlets and encourage registered professional engineers for the certification if they are to be granted the concessions. However, it has been reported that in respect of some development projects which have benefited from the aforesaid measure, all of the parking spaces have been installed with charging socket outlets, but such installations are useless as all of the socket outlets are not connected to the power supply. In this connection, would the government inform this council, 1, of the number of development projects to date which have been granted GFA concessions, together with the floor area for which concessions were granted, the number of parking spaces provided, and the charging speed of the charging facilities concerned, broken down by the name of building or housing court, 2, of the existing procedure, 4, as well as the government departments involved in vetting and approval of applications for GFA concessions, whether such procedures covers vetting and approval of building plans of car parks, site inspections and tests on charging facilities, and of the division of work among the relevant government departments. And 3, in relation to the development projects which have been granted GFA concessions, whether the authorities have put in place a mechanism to ensure that the property management companies or the owners' corporations concerned
provide functioning charging facilities to parking spaces concerned on an ongoing basis and keep such facilities under proper repair and maintenance? If so, of the details, including the penalties which may be imposed on the parties who fail to provide such facilities, if not, the reasons for that. Secretary for the Environment. President, following the recommendations of the Council for Sustainable Development, the government introduced a package of measures in April 2011 to enhance the design standard of new buildings to foster a quality and sustainable built environment. They include tightening gross floor area or GFA concessions to avoid inflated buildings and meet public aspirations for more green and amenity features in development projects. One of the tightened requirements is that instead of all car parks being exempted from GFA calculations, only underground car parks provided with infrastructure for enabling electric vehicle or EV charging facilities as such. Do you have a mobile phone nearby, Secretary? Please place it somewhere else. I apologize. The underground car parks are encouraged to address the public concern that car parks are a significant contributor to building bulk and height. These new measures aim to encourage developers to put in place EV charging enabling infrastructure in car parks of new private buildings so that if EVs are widely used in the future, owners of parking spaces will not be hindered from installing the required EV chargers due to constraints in power supply, capacity, cabling, and conduits, etc. On this basis, the Environment Bureau and the Electrical and Mechanical Services Department have issued the technical guidelines for EV charging enabling for car parks of the new building developments, hereafter referred to as the guidelines, stipulated that future GFA concessions for car parks of new buildings will only be granted if car parks meet the basic conditions of providing EV charging enabling infrastructure. These basic conditions include the provision of switchboards, distribution boards, cabling, conduits, and trunking, so the owners of parking spaces may install EV chargers at their parking spaces according to their specific needs in the future. As EVs were still at the development stage back then, mainstream standards for EV chargers and related installations were not yet established. Therefore, the guidelines have not required the installation of EV chargers and electricity meter connection at parking spaces provided with EV charging enabling infrastructure. From April 2011 to September 2017, the Buildings Department approved a total of about 370 building plans involving the exemption of car parks of new buildings from total GFA calculations. Upon completion, these developments will provide about 40,000 parking spaces with EV charging enabling infrastructure. The building has not compiled a list of the buildings or housing courts involved, the GFA conceded, and the number of parking spaces provided. Nonetheless, when these developments are issued with occupation permits or OP, members of the public may check the approved building plans and other details such as total GFA calculations from the building records access and viewing online of BD. Given that the guidelines have not required the installation of EV chargers and electricity meter connection at parking spaces provided with such infrastructure, the government has no data on the specific charging facilities available in these venues and their charging speed. 2. As required in the guidelines, an authorized person or AP applying for disregarding the GFA for underground car parks when calculation of the total GFA of new private buildings shall have the FEI design certified in advance by a registered professional engineer or RPE under the Engineers Registration Ordinance of either the electrical or building services discipline. Information on the certified FEI design of the EV charging enabling infrastructure, together with the related general building plan shall then be submitted by an AP to BD for consideration. BD will approve the application in accordance with established arrangement, subject to the requirements set out in the current guidelines being met, and upon receiving approval of the plan and permit for commencing building works, developers may commence construction works. After completion of construction works, LPEs as specified in the guidelines have to submit to the BD via an AP a certificate of completion certifying that the concerned car park's EV charging enabling infrastructure as prescribed in the design information are fully installed, tested and commissioned to support the application for OP. The BD will vet such application according to Section 21(6) of the Buildings Ordinance, will also conduct random site inspections according to established procedures. As mentioned above, in encouraging developers to provide EV charging enabling infrastructure for car parks of new private buildings, the government's objective is to enable owners of parking spaces to install chargers at their parking spaces and arrange for power connection according to their specific needs in the future without being constrained by the power supply capacity, cabling, and conduits, etc. Back in 2011, EVs were still at a development stage, and mainstream standards for EV chargers and related installations were not yet established. Hence, installation of chargers with electricity meter connection at parking spaces with such infrastructure has not been included as a mandatory requirement in the guidelines. In view of the rapid changes in the usage of EVs, the government is reviewing the various policies and measures on the promotion of the use of such. We will explore ways to encourage installation of charging facilities to tie in with the usage of EVs, retrofitting existing car parks with charging facilities, and updating the relevant guidelines and planning standards as necessary. Mr. Kenneth LEUNG. President, there are reports that a developer has got 200 EV enabling parking spaces of EV facilities and have cheated 170,000 square feet of GFA, and these parking spaces are not fitted with power supply. And according to the Secretary's reply, in 2001, EVs were still at their development stage, so there were no standards for such chargers and related installations, and therefore it was not mandatory for the power supply to be provided. It's been 7 years, and the guidelines are very outdated, and many developers have used this loophole to cheat the government out of GFAs. So when will the guidelines be updated? What will be the scope of the review, and we ensure that exemption on GFA or GFA concessions will be granted when there is sufficient power supply for these parking spaces? Secretary, as I said, when those guidelines were formulated, there were no such standards. So we were of the view that basic infrastructure should be provided so that when necessary, chargers and also power supply could be provided without any constraints. It's true that there have been rapid changes in the usage of EVs in the past few months, and things are changing very rapidly. We have started a review on how to promote the use of EVs, and that will include how we can increase EV charging facilities in existing car parks. So what Mr. Leung said was correct. Speaker was off mic. Please allow the Secretary to answer your question. Secretary, we're now reviewing how we're going to do that. I cannot give you a specific time frame now, but the measures will be divided into immediate measures and those where some conditions have to be met first. Depending on the outcome of our review, we will review the relevant guidelines and standards. Mr. Tet Hui. Thank you, President. The Secretary's reply was rather shocking. The policy intent was to allow developers of developments, including shopping malls, to provide car parking spaces with EV charging facilities. Now, you have just told us that so long as the infrastructure is provided, no power supply is mandated. So developers have benefited from GFA concessions, but they are not really chargeable. So you talked about 40,000 parking spaces provided with such infrastructure, but you don't have a list of such developments. How can you monitor the situation? You just told us that you're going to review the guidelines. After your review, will you ensure that developers of shopping malls in particular must provide parking spaces with power supply? So for the 40,000 parking spaces with such infrastructure but no power supply, can you urge them to provide the power connection, please, in particular those in shopping malls? Secretary, thank you. For parking car parks already established or completed, we have checked them. And for housing developments, infrastructure is available. When owners of parking spaces have their own EVs, they will install their own chargers. But without such infrastructure, that is not possible. With the infrastructure, it will be convenient for owners to install chargers in the future. You asked whether GFA concessions will only be granted if power supply is provided. We will include this possibility in our review. Mr. Ted Hui, one of my questions not been answered. You only allowed one supplementary question, but you've asked two. The Secretary has already answered one. Mr. Dennis Kwok, I'm sure the Secretary understands that there's a report to say that by 2030, China will be supplying 50% of the EVs available. So many governments are saying that by 2030, by 2040, all vehicles should be EVs. In this regard, will the government have a similar vision so that come one day, all the vehicles on our roads will be EVs? Mr. Kwok, your supplementary question is not relevant to the original question and answer, but I'll see if the Secretary has got anything to add. Thank you, Mr. Kwok, for your question. Yes, we have noted the aspirations of vision of some countries. Whether we can have this vision and timetable in Hong Kong, complicated factors involved. We do not have local manufacturers, but we'll explore this very proactively to see whether we can have a similar vision. Mr. Jeremy Tam. Thank you, President. This question is rather outrageous. It was reported, but we've also seen such a scenario. So they have a 30A power outlet provided, socket outlet, and that's fine. And if I ask security or the guards whether we can use the charger, the answer is no, or we ask to make an application. But the car parking spaces are provided on an hourly basis. How can I apply? And GFA concessions have already been granted, but their ordinary users cannot use the EV charging facilities. According to your reply, so long as such enabling infrastructure is provided, that's okay. And it will be for the future owners or users to install chargers for EV charging. But the answer is no. Can you come to a supplementary question? Yes, my supplementary question is, I'd like to know whether the relevant provisions have ensured that owners must allow, or the developers must allow motorists to use such chargers. Otherwise, what's the use of providing such infrastructure? Secretary. Yes, as I explained, when the guidelines were introduced, it was rather forward-looking. Back then, there were not too many EVs in Hong Kong, and it was impossible to have standards for these infrastructures. So we have to ensure that developments have the basic infrastructure so that when EVs become prevalent, the owners can install chargers. Back then, there was no requirements on power supply to be provided. There were no standards at all. However, the situation has changed. After so many years, we've seen a substantial increase in the use of EVs. We are now conducting a review to see how we can promote the use of EV and whether these guidelines have to be updated. This will all be covered in our review. Which part of the question has been answered? My question was very simple. Now, if the management staff do not allow you to use the charging facilities. Given the concessions in GFA have been granted, will you recover premium from these developers? Secretary, on how to promote the use of EVs and increase in charging facilities, we are now conducting a review. Mr. Charles MOK. Now, the question is, the legislation is here, how will you enforce it? If you're not happy with the Secretary's reply, please follow up on another occasion. Mr. Charles MOK, when it comes to the promotion of EV, the Secretary said that it was very complicated. How can we be more complicated from the whole of China, France, and other places? They are able to do it. Now, it's complicated in Hong Kong because our government is very compartmentalized. Government departments only mind their own business. Now, even you can say that by 2030, all EVs, all vehicles in Hong Kong can only be EVs. Then I don't know how these departments can handle it. According to our reply, the government is reviewing the various policies and measures on promoting the use of EVs. I'd like to know what departments and bureaus are involved. Can you give us a list of bureaus and departments handling this review? What bureaus and departments are taking forward the review so that they won't be passing the buck to one another, and we don't want to make life difficult for you. This is about a development, building developments. I don't know why the Secretary for the Environment is here to answer this question. Secretary, it will be an inter-bureau and interdepartmental review. As far as we know, the Transport Bureau, the Development Bureau, EMSD, Lands Department are involved. But I can give you a list, a comprehensive list of the departments and bureaus later. Mr. Kenneth LEUNG. Mr. Charles MOK said that departments only mind their own business and then they are passing the buck to one another. According to the CE, there must be a respective bureau to lead a certain policy. It cannot be if several bureaus or departments are jointly responsible. So for the promotion on the use of EV, which department or bureau is responsible? The review on policies and measures to promote the use of EV, the Environment Bureau is the lead bureau.
Last question seeking an Last question seeking an oral reply. Mr. Paul TSE. President, the Court of Final Appeal CFA handed down a judgment in May 2015 that the China Cam Charitable Foundation Limited was to hold as a trustee the late Miss Nina Kong's estate of tens of billions of dollars, which was dedicated to charitable purposes. In response to the relevant questions I raised in June 2015 and February 2016, the former Secretary for Justice, S.J., said that as the protector of charities, he would actively follow up the arrangements for and the details of the implementation of Ms. Kong's will and would eventually, as directed by CFA, submit a scheme on using the estate for charitable purposes, the scheme, to the court for approval. He expected the Department of Justice, DOJ, to complete the formulation of the scheme by around mid-2016. Before that, the estate would continue to be administered by the independent interim administrators appointed by the court. However, DOJ has not published the scheme so far. Moreover, since the inauguration of the current term government, the former SJ resigned after serving for only 6 months, and his successor is embroiled in a scandal involving unauthorized building works found in her residence, and she has also been granted exceptional approval by the chief executive to continue with her handling of 6 ongoing arbitration cases and her teaching commitments concurrently, raising public concern whether she can handle official matters wholeheartedly in the near future. In this connection, will the government inform this Council 1 whether DOJ has completed the formulation of the scheme and submitted it to the court? If so, when DOJ submitted the scheme? If not, of the reasons for that, and how much additional time DOJ will need to finish the formulation of the scheme, which commenced 2.5 years ago. If the work cannot be finished shortly, whether the authorities have studied if SJ's performance in exercising the function as the protector of charities has highlighted DOJ's lack of operational efficiency, falling short of public expectations, and failure in fulfilling the last wish of Ms. Kong. 2. Given that the estate has all along been under the administration of accountants serving as the interim administrators since the aforesaid judgment was handed down by CFA in May 2015, whether the authorities have assessed if the management fees charged by the accountants are reasonable, and if Ms. Kong's estate has been gnawed by the relevant expenses. And 3. Whether it has assessed if public confidence in the government's implementation of policies will be affected by the fact that Ms. Kong's estate of tens of billions of dollars has not been put to charitable uses for a number of years. Secretary for Justice. President, I would like to thank the member for the question. Ms. Nina Wang passed away in April 2007, leaving a homemade Chinese will dated the 28th of July 2002. On the 2nd of May 2012, SJ, as the protector of charity, commenced proceedings in the Court of First Instance, seeking the court's adjudication on the proper construction of the will in order to ensure proper management and ultimate distribution of the estate. The Court of Final Appeal handed down its judgment on the 18th of May 2015 and unanimously ruled that the China Kam Charitable Foundation Limited, the foundation, should hold the entire estate as a trustee and would not receive any part of the estate as an unconditional absolute gift. According to the Court of Final Appeal judgment, a scheme should be prepared and submitted to the High Court for approval after consultation between the foundation and SJ as the protector of public charity. Following the judgment of the Court of Final Appeal, DOJ has been liaising with the foundation through meetings and correspondence to exchange views on the preparation of the scheme and related matters for administering the estate. However, as parties had to work out the complicated and detailed arrangements for the establishment of a managing organization to supervise the foundation and the Chinese prize, for example, how we can make the foundation as a trustee, and there's another example which is about setting up a Chinese prize of worldwide significance similar to that of the Nobel Prize. And all these issues involve complicated and detailed arrangements, and there's need for this discussion. So the parties had taken more time to consider the scheme in detail. DOJ had also sought advice from independent legal advice on the relevant legal issues. The scheme had been amended a few times, with the latest draft being drawn up in May 2017. The scheme has been sent to the foundation pending their response. During the relevant period, parties had sought directions from the court in respect of the costs matter arising from the preparation of the scheme. As of now, DOJ and the foundation are still discussing the details of the latest draft scheme. We are still waiting for more specific response from the foundation. It is estimated that some more time is required. Nonetheless, we hope to reach further consensus with the foundation as soon as possible. And once, in respect of the contents of the latest draft scheme, once it is done, DOJ would submit the draft scheme to the court. DOJ is aware of the public expectation to utilize the funds of the estate for charitable purposes as soon as possible. In view of this, DOJ has been actively working on the drafting of the scheme as well as liaising with the foundation accordingly, including to continue to explore the setting up of a supervising managing organization jointly formed by the Secretary General of the United Nations, the Premier of the PRC government, as well as the Chief Executive of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region as intended in the will. DOJ will continue to closely monitor its progress. If necessary, we may need to seek guidance from the court to ensure that the scheme can be implemented as soon as possible in accordance with the testamentary intention of Mrs. Wang in administering the estate. Currently, the administration of the estate is vested with the interim administrators appointed by the court. DOJ has also filed a caveat against a grant of probate or administration to preserve the status quo pending a scheme to be set up under the court's supervisory jurisdiction. The current interim administrators are professional accountants appointed by the court. Their principal responsibilities are to get in and preserve the properties of the estate, including making inquiries as they deem reasonably necessary, or taking out legal proceedings to ensure that the estate is properly preserved. Besides, the relevant work also includes handling matters arising from the operation of the China Cam Group. As the China Cam Group is a big business conglomerate comprising numerous companies with multiple areas of business, the relevant work activities can be very complicated, as we understand. The interim administrators have been overseeing the China Cam Group and made efforts to improve its governance structure to ensure the smooth operation of various lines of corporate business. In discharge of their duties, the interim administrators would investigate and take follow-up actions against any irregularities known to them, which might prejudice the proper preservation and management of the estate. The interim administrators are also required to submit periodical reports to the court, SJ, and the foundation on the conduct of the administration. Being officers of the court, the interim administrators owe a duty to the court on matters relating to the interim administration of the estate. The court may also give directions to the interim administrators if and when necessary. The work of the interim administrators will continue to be monitored by the court, including the consideration of the periodical reports and other relevant materials provided by them. DOJ has at all times been paying close attention to the administration of the estate and has been in frequent contact with the interim administrators, including considering the periodical reports provided by the interim administrators, approaching the interim administrators to further understand matters relating to the interim administration of the estate, requiring the interim administrators to follow up or report as necessary, and assisting the court in legal proceedings taken out by the interim administrators and seeking directions from the court in the course of interim administration as may be required. DOJ will continue to pay close attention to the work of the interim administrators in managing and preserving the estate, as well as legal proceedings involving the China Cam Group and the foundation. Appropriate follow-up actions will be taken as necessary. Regarding the fees of the independent interim administrators, they have been prescribed by the court in the appointment order and are subject to the court's scrutiny. DOJ and the foundation have also been monitoring the fees charged by the interim administrators. Should DOJ and the foundation consider the amounts to be too high or unreasonable, an application may be made to the court for taxation of the fees in order to ensure that the interim administrator's fees remain reasonable. As the protector of charity, SJ will actively follow up on the detailed arrangements for the implementation of the will in light of the blueprint laid down in the Court of Final Appeal judgment, including continuing to keep in contact with the Foundation as the trustee of the estate and to work closely with the interim administrators, discussing the follow-up actions required, closely monitoring the management and preservation of the estate of Mrs. Nina Wang and taking such follow-up actions as may be necessary, including seeking of guidance from the court as may be required with a view to protecting and safeguarding the interest of the charity. Thank you, President. Thank you, Member. Mr. Paul TSE. President, Madam Deputy, I wonder if the SJ knows that for those who have information about the estate, the size of the estate would be like $230 billion or so. This is a huge sum. Now, the matter has been dragged on for 2.5 years, and that you have not fulfilled the court's judgment, one of which is to make sure there is a reliable management structure. Now, Dr. Kong and others are now in control of the estate, including the interim administrators, too. Why would you, first of all, consider setting up a proper governance structure? There's no need to give various excuses to say it's difficult to follow up and so on. So to make sure that there is a proper management. And more importantly, you have to consider whether there is any collusion. Now, Dr. Kong is the person in charge of the foundation. What about his connections with the interim administrators? How much does the SJ know, the DOJ know about it, or do you just rely on the reports of the so-called reports of the interim administrators in monitoring their performance? Secretary for Justice. I agree. The very first thing we must do is to set up a management structure, because in the will there are three persons mentioned for setting up this managing organization. So since I suppose I have studied that and I've considered it. Now, on the question of whether the managing organization could be set up, I believe very soon I'll be able to give an account to the member and the community, because I fully agree with you. Now, if the managing organization can be set up, then other issues may be easier to tackle. But of course, I understand we must first have discussion with the foundation. If there is a consensus, then we have to submit to the court for approval. If there's no consensus, then we have to seek the ruling of the court. So on this point, I fully agree with you. Second point, concern of whether there is any conflict of interest. The interim administrator is appointed by the court. The interim administrators are the officers of the court, so there's a need to maintain independence. As qualified accountants, I'm sure they will go by their professional code in the conduct of business, but it doesn't mean we won't monitor or supervise their work. If we become aware of any evidence, or if we have any suspicion that this might happen, then as the Secretary for Justice and my colleagues will certainly take suitable follow-up actions if there is any such suspicion. Mr. Dennis Kwok. Thank you, Madam Deputy. In the question, there is asked whether the supervision by the DOJ is effective. In fact, in 2013, the Law Reform Commission put forward a whole set of recommendations to improve the supervision of charitable organizations. So as the SJ, would you take a look into that? Now, in 2013, the Law of Reform Commission already came up with a set of recommendations, and like many other recommendations of the LLC, they have not been implemented for years. So for this particular set of recommendations of the LLC, can you tell us when this will be put into place in monitoring charitable organizations? Thank you, member, for the question. As I said when I assumed my post, that I would like to be in communication with the professions and members. On Monday, when I had a discussion with the Law Society, they also mentioned this point. That is, in 2013, the LRC published a report on the matter. As you might recall, that report is not entirely uncontentious. There are certain points with contention, but at least a broad direction has been set. So the profession has this message that we should see what we can do with the charitable, with the organization's law. But as the protector of charities and as the SJ, on Nina Kong's, as I will continue to follow up on that, because we cannot wait till the recommendations of the LRC's 2013 reports are implemented. The member asked for a time frame. I'm sorry I cannot provide a time frame yet, but as you've mentioned this point, and we are also aware of, so this is certainly something we are considering what we can do about. Mr. Hon Charles. Thank you, Madam Deputy. Well, this happened quite some time ago. In the main reply, we learned that the interim administrators are now administering the estate. And there's need to set up a scheme to manage the foundation. Now, for the interim administrators, we're not questioning their motive, but they are being paid for doing the work. So is there any better supervision so that the scheme could be put in place sooner, and then the trust could operate sooner? Otherwise, the interim administrators will continue to benefit in collecting fees for administering the estate. Secretary, thank you. The DOJ and the foundation are both concerned about this point because fees are being deducted from the estate. That's why the fees have to be submitted to the DOJ and the foundation for vetting. If we consider the fees too high, we have the power to do something about it. In fact, there has been a court ruling that we could ask the courts to tax the costs. So if there is a problem, we can go to the court and ask for a taxation of the costs. This will make sure the costs are reasonable. I wouldn't want to use this term, that we don't want the costs to deplete the estate unreasonably. Thank you. In particular, in terms of the actual value of the estate. Mr. Paul TSE, thank you for your reply to my first question. That's encouraging and as a way forward. This third last paragraph, the SJ will follow up on legal proceedings and follow up when necessary. In 2014, there was the 832 case involving Dr. Kong, and that's a supposition of conversion of $50 million. And then, as 2016, January 12, again, Dr. Kong was sued for collusion and deception for $50 million again. So with all these cases, are you sure, SJ, that for persons managing the estate, they should be someone of highest integrity and judgment. So someone with a high standard of ethics and so on. Now, Dr. Kong was put in charge of such a large sum of money. And given his tenuous connections with the interim administrators, would that cause unease to the public? Secretary, thank you for the question. Now, because there are criminal cases involved, under Article 63 of the Basic Law, I have to take charge of criminal matters. As the protector of charities, I also have certain duties. So that's why internally, I've made a delegation of powers for issues involving criminal matters. I won't be involved. Now, as to whether the person is meeting the requirements, the ruling of the CFA, that's something we keep looking at. Now, as I said, we have already drafted a scheme. We've submitted it to the foundation. We're waiting for a response. And before we get a response, at the same time, we could also set up a management organization. As to whether we can set up the management organization, we have to ask the three parties mentioned in the will. So we know if any one of the if the parties agree or not, then we know whether we need to take it to the court. So we don't have to wait for one issue to be dealt with before we take up the next. We could take a parallel approach. Thank you. End of questions.
Government bills first reading. 廣州、深圳